Supreme Court ruling ends Cindy George's case. In the 5 months since she was released from prison, her lawyer said Cindy George has left her palatial home to go to Mass, meet a few times with girlfriends, and attend her daughter's high school graduation. She will remain in self-imposed seclusion despite the Ohio Supreme Court's decision Wednesday, not to review the reversal of her conviction for plotting with one lover to kill another, the lawyer said. That ruling closes the case. She was pleased but wants to be able to calm life down for the kids and the rest of the family, said her attorney Bradley Barbin. You need a low profile for that. George, 53, who faced national media scrutiny during her murder trial and release, will not sue the Summit County Prosecutor's Office for wrongful prosecution, Barbin said. There is not a mean bone in her body, he said. People never got the untold story of Cindy George. In a written statement, George said, "With this decision and the closure it provides, it is time that we as a family move forward with our lives." Prosecutors, who maintain George plotted with lover John Zaffino to kill her former lover Zack, are disappointed George is free. The justice system was created with appellate rights, and this office respects the legal system and therefore accepts the decision of the Supreme Court, Prosecutor Sherry Bevan Walsh said in a statement. Zack, 44, of Stowe, was fatally shot in the face on June 16, 2001, as he sat in his sport utility vehicle at a gas pump. Witnesses saw a motorcycle and driver with his face obscured by a dark helmet leaving the scene. Zaffino, 40, was arrested about a year later. He was convicted of murder in 2003 and sentenced to life in prison. All appeals have failed. George was arrested in January 2005. She did not testify in her trial before Summit County Common Pleas Judge Patricia Cosgrove. Cosgrove ruled that George was guilty of complicity to commit aggravated murder and sentenced her to life in prison without a chance of parole for 23 years. George served 16 months before she was released on March 22nd. The 9th Ohio District Court of Appeals ruled that the circumstantial evidence presented by prosecutors, including telephone records, letters, and financial documents, was insufficient to prove her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Barbin said that George's husband Ed and their 7 children have unwavering support. He said she has remained sequestered in her Medina County home by choice, preferring to spend time with her children. She has undergone counseling. She has a firm faith and believes in her family, Barbin said, and she wants to thank all the people willing to support her despite those who rushed to judgment and found it so easy to kick someone when they are down. Zack typed the name Cynthia George into a search engine. After a 10-year extramarital love affair, she had broken up with him. They'd had their troubles of late, but he had not expected to lose her. Now he was trying everything that he could think to reconnect. If he realized she was involved with another man, he either did not know or did not care how dangerous that person might be. He was persistent. It was the morning before Father's Day, and as he performed his obsessive search, Zack's wife and son were in another room nearby, unaware of what he was doing. Without any explanation to them, he left home. He didn't even take time to put on his shoes. But he usually went out on Saturday mornings to purchase supplies from BJ's Wholesale Club to fill his various vending machines. It was his routine, so they thought nothing of it. He drove his Ford SUV to Home Avenue in Akron, Ohio, refueled at a gas pump. He did not know that someone waiting for him was now watching him. The other man involved with Cynthia George knew Zack's regular store visit and was seated on a motorcycle in the parking lot. Anyone who noticed him would have seen that he was dressed all in black and had even shielded his face with a dark visor. He looked like some ghost rider, strangely out of place on a summer day. But he was all too real. He touched a recently purchased holstered revolver to reassure himself it was ready. When he spotted Zack's car at the gas pump, he rode over and pulled up behind him. Getting off the bike as if preparing to fill it, the dark biker walked calmly instead to the passenger side window of Zack's SUV, lifted the gun and fired a single shot. It shattered the glass and hit Zack square in the head. He slumped over onto the steering wheel in a spray of blood that covered the inside of the windshield and driver's window. The pump attendant, Carolyn Hyson, stood only a few feet away, too surprised to move. The biker appeared to look right at her, although she could not see his face through the visor before remounting to roar away. Afterward, she was amazed that he hadn't shot her as well. This was a calculated hit. Once she acted, Hyson shakily called 911 to get the police and an ambulance there. She was able to describe to responding officers the ninja-style gray and black motorcycle with lime green stripes and the heavy-set man with a gun who had ridden it. However, for Zack, it was too late. At the age of 44, he was dead, killed by a single copper-jacketed hollow-point bullet. The biker made a call before he rode over the state line to Pennsylvania, where he intended to establish an alibi and get rid of the bike. Having purchased it recently, he had only one use for it. It took detectives only a day to connect Jeff Zack with Cynthia George, who was married to the wealthy owner of the Tangiers restaurant. They even knew that one of her 7 children had probably been fathered by him. However, she already had a lawyer and he blocked their inquiries. They also learned about Cynthia George's new paramour, John Zaffino, but he had an alibi. He was at a car show that day in Pennsylvania. Nothing about this case was going to come easy. In fact, over a year would pass before police had a solid piece of evidence. In the meantime, they learned what they could about the victim. This case was heavily covered in the Akron Beacon-Journal and Cleveland Plain-Dealer, as well as by the A&E series American Justice, because the woman with whom Zack had been involved was the wife of a prominent businessman, well known in the community. The case proved to be a sordid Midwestern version of the lifestyles of the rich and famous. The intrigue would grow more complicated as more information was learned about the adulterous web of Cynthia George. Investigators learned that Jeff Zack had a few enemies, according to reporters. He was a complex man with a sharp temper who often fought with neighbors over trifling things. He'd also had a few business dealings that could have inspired someone to shoot him, and he'd hit on several married women and had been unfaithful to his wife. In short, there were several suspects in this crime, but there was little evidence linking any of them to the shooting. Abandoned as a child by his biological father, Zack had taken the name of his stepfather. He was educated, multilingual, and successful as a stockbroker. Tall and handsome, he had a reputation as a womanizer, as well as for defying the law. In 1981, he'd been convicted in connection with an illegal escort agency in Arizona, and in 1996, he had grabbed an adolescent girl in a hardware store and kissed her. At the time, he'd been married to his wife, Bonnie Cook, for 10 years. When his firm in Arizona was caught mishandling money in 1991, he moved to Akron to start over. It wasn't long before he spotted Cynthia George at the Tangier bar. He was instantly obsessed. In her late 30s, Cynthia was a small-town girl and aspiring beauty queen. Blonde and slender, she was also quite flirtatious and married to Ed George, 15 years her senior. Nevertheless, she still caught the eye of other men. By some accounts, she freely hit on them. In front of Bonnie, Zack acted openly enthralled, and she could see trouble ahead. It wasn't long before he was embroiled with Cynthia in an adulterous affair. Even so, the Zacks and George became friends. Zack often came to the George home on weekends to take Cynthia on bike rides or for walks. He also called her so frequently on the phone it was difficult to believe he didn't realize how obvious he was being. Perhaps he did not care. Yet Bonnie would later say she did not know. They were having an affair until years later in 1998, and she overheard one of Zack's conversations. She confronted him and he apologized and promised to change. He said he would stop the affair but not his friendship with Cynthia. Nonetheless, he remained obsessed, and it showed. Cynthia, too, made frequent calls to him. Apparently, despite her palatial home and wealthy lifestyle, she was bored. The nanny, Mary Ann Brewer, said that Cynthia was away from home much of the time, while Ed was the one who took an active role with the children. She described Cynthia as self-absorbed. The idle rich can prove easily bored and even illicit. Affairs can grow stale. Journalist Phil Trexler reported in the Beacon-Journal that Cynthia had met unemployed trucker John F. Zaffino in 2000 and was soon involved with him. Zaffino, 36, was known to have an aggressive temper, especially when he drank. Despite the son they shared, his first wife had left him after 6 years. His second marriage, to Christine Todaro, lasted only a few months, although he apparently would later keep in touch with her. Cynthia became involved with Zaffino after he started taking her out for walks, but she also kept up her affair with Zack. It was 9 months before she decided in May 2001 that she no longer wished to continue the relationship with Zack. She asked him to leave her alone. He was not one to be so lightly cast aside. He continued to call her. As she would tell it, she tried to end the relationship many times over at least 3 years, but he always threatened her. Ed George became perturbed by the constant phone calls to his home. He called a friend on the police force to report them and to ask what to do. He suspected Zack, but the caller frequently hung up. He did not want a public investigation, so there was no follow-up. Still, he suspected that his wife was at the heart of this trouble. According to phone records, Cynthia kept both Zack and Zaffino on the line simultaneously. While Zaffino spoke with her by cell phone, she sometimes used a second line to talk to Zack. No one else would learn what they were all saying, but the tension was building. However, Zack soon met another woman during a plane trip and spent a week with her outside town. He seemed to have moved one. By the next month, though, Zack was dead. A reward was offered for information, and a tipster sent police to a woman who once had been married to John Zaffino. She admitted that she'd been privy to an odd conversation. In 2001, Zaffino had told her he'd just beaten up a white-haired Israeli. Then she read about the murder of Jeff Zack, who was described as a former Israeli paratrooper with silver-gray hair, and wondered if there was some connection. She called Zaffino in the middle of the night, and as she put it, he said, "Well, let's just say the guy's going to have a hard time parting his hair from now on." Investigators then learned that Zaffino had recently purchased a motorcycle, although he had introduced himself to the dealer as John Smith. He had mentioned that he did not plan to keep the bike for long. To show the police the kind of bike that John Smith had purchased on May 24th, the dealer searched the internet. He came up with an identical bike for sale in McMurray, Penn. It wasn't long before investigators put 2 and 2 together and realized it was the same bike. The purchaser bought it in May and then took it across the state line to sell to another dealer. That led them to Zaffino's first wife, whose fiancé owned the dealership. They had taken it in exchange for the child support that he owed. The ex-wife described how her former husband had come during the night, eager to get rid of the bike and even placed tape over the green stripes. The coincidences were coming hard and fast. While this discovery wasn't solid evidence, it was strongly suggestive, and Zaffino became the primary suspect. Christine Todaro agreed to wear a recording device and tape calls made to him beginning in June 2002. This lasted 3 months, over which time Zaffino grew increasingly more paranoid. He even suspected her of wearing a wire and warned her not to talk with the police. He never admitted to anything directly. Soon the police found phone records that destroyed Zaffino's alibi. A friend had said that Zaffino was at a car show about 40 minutes away when Zack was shot. However, the records showed that he was calling the friend on his cell phone rather than being at the show. He had arrived at the show some 2 hours after the shooting. There was reason to believe that the witness corroborating the alibi had been intimidated into making a false statement. At the end of September, Zaffino was arrested and charged with aggravated murder. The police were confident that he was the black-clad man on the motorcycle, and a search of his home produced cell phone bills with many calls to Cynthia George. Then bank records indicated that she had withdrawn $5,300 just before Zaffino had purchased the gray and black Honda CBR, 1,000 motorcycle and some helmets for that amount. There were also calls between them on June 16th before and after Zack had been shot, and a few days later when Zaffino had taken the motorcycle to Pennsylvania. Investigators later surmised that there had been a plan in place as early as May to lure Zack to a remote area because a police officer had come across Zaffino at Cuyahoga Valley National Park with an empty holster in his car. A few days later, someone found a .32 caliber pistol in the nearby park. Zaffino had purchased a .32 caliber before that, which he couldn't produce. Later in the month after this incident, he had also purchased a .357 Magnum, which took hollow point, bullets similar to the one that had killed Zack. The circumstantial evidence was strong, enough for a case. Zaffino went to trial on February 26, 2003. Assistant Summit County Prosecutor Michael Carroll offered evidence for his theory that Zaffino had snuffed out Zack because of Zack's inability to let go of Cynthia George after she ended their affair. He argued that Zack had made harassing phone calls to the George residence and had become involved in a feud with Zaffino over Cynthia. Since Zack had not gone away quietly alone, Zaffino then plotted to get rid of him permanently. He'd made an aborted attempt in May and completed the act in June. On March 7th, Cynthia George was brought in to testify, but instead of clarifying her role, she invoked the Fifth Amendment, citing her constitutional right not to incriminate herself. Her husband did likewise. The prosecution's best witness was Christine Todaro. She testified about Zaffino's response to her question about the man he'd assaulted. The tapes of her subsequent conversations with him while wearing a wire were played. For the jury, Zaffino's attorney, Lawrence Whitney, claimed that the evidence proved nothing. It was circumstantial at best. Truthfully, there was no smoking gun and no eyewitness who could identify the shooter. Zaffino did not testify on his behalf or admit to an affair with George. He remained mum. On the same day as closing arguments, though after a 4-hour deliberation, the jury convicted Zaffino of aggravated murder. He declined comment and was then sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for at least 23 years. However, Zack's wife, Bonnie, addressed Zaffino during the sentencing, accusing him of being merely a fall guy, taking the heat while Cynthia George continued her opulent lifestyle. Zack's son asked him, "Was it worth it?" Both wanted him to speak out and reveal the whole truth. The question remained whether Cynthia George would be charged with anything. Still, at that time, the police would not reveal their next move except to say she was indeed a suspect, and that they were continuing to investigate the possibility that more than one person had been involved with Zack's murder. In December 2003, the District Court of Appeals upheld Zaffino's conviction, but Zaffino remained uncooperative. Nearly a year later, the A&E network aired a show about the case, Who Whacked Zack?, which focused on the possible extent of Cynthia George's involvement. The pressure was on to make an arrest, and the police were building a case. On January 10, 2005, while Cynthia was out shopping at a Bath and Body Works store, she was placed under arrest and charged with both complicity and conspiracy to commit aggravated murder. Taken to Summit County Jail, her bond was set at $10 million. She would now have her day in court. Given her status in the community, interest in the trial was great. Cynthia, now 50, sat quietly during her arraignment as her attorney, Michael Bowler, asked for reduced bail, which was denied. He told reporters that his client was disappointed. She maintained that she had no involvement with the shooting of Zack. Prosecutors said they had new information that had allowed them to indict her. They were referring to the evidence that Zaffino had planned an earlier hit on May 8th at the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, possibly aborted when a park ranger had happened by. Zaffino had been at the bridge talking on a cell phone with Cynthia for about 3 hours. She was also talking with Zack on another line at the time. The ranger spotted an empty gun holster and questioned Zaffino about it. He said he'd left the gun at home and was there waiting for his girlfriend. Over a week later, a mushroom hunter came across a .32 caliber pistol in the park. Because Cynthia was on the phone with Zaffino at the time, this incident was at the heart of the conspiracy charge. George was also charged with complicity in Zack's June 16th fatal shooting. Her bank and phone records supported the notion that she had known of the incident and was involved. At the next hearing, the bail was reduced to $2 million, and after her husband posted 10%, Cynthia was released. Since she had expected the arrest and had not fled, the judge decided she was not a flight risk, as prosecutors insisted. Restrictions were placed on her, limiting how far she could travel. She entered not guilty pleas to the charges and left the courtroom with her husband and daughter. They knew that the possibility of her going to prison until she was 70 hung in the balance. The second trial, Cynthia's trial, began in November 2005. Hers is a soap opera tale, wrote Phil Trexler in the Akron Beacon Journal. Her lover is killed, a second lover is convicted of the murder, and a love child is the supposed motive. Her 5-member defense team included Robert Meeker and Michael Bowler, and her trial was expected to last the better part of a month. Trial watchers hoped she would try to impress the jury by testifying. The evidence against her was essentially the same set of records and circumstances that had convicted her former lover, John Zaffino. However, this time, the gossip was expected to be juicier, with more details about Cynthia and her affairs. However, one more incriminating detail was revealed. The George family had financed Zaffino's defense. Cynthia's attorneys had brokered the deal, retaining Zaffino's counsel. Assistant Prosecutor Michael Carroll rarely lost a high-profile case. While he admitted to reporters that the case was circumstantial, he believed the totality of the suspicious circumstances would be convincing even against a wealthy socialite. Jurors took less than 4 hours to convict Zaffino, and while Cynthia was not the shooter, there was good reason to believe she was complicit, if not an instigator. During jury selection, Cynthia brought a book to read, Prayers and Promises for Women, and she attended the day-long event without her husband. Reporters described her as being at ease, as if she had nothing to worry about. One new item was a confession Zaffino had allegedly made to another inmate. Cynthia's attorneys tried blocking it, but the judge allowed it as evidence. In addition, officials had taped phone calls that Zaffino made to his sisters, which contained incriminating statements that suggested a conspiracy with Cynthia, and the judge allowed these as well. But then Cynthia's attorneys surprised everyone by announcing they would seek a bench trial where a judge would hear the case rather than a jury. This decision was precipitated by the judge's refusal to change the venue from Summit County, where the case had become sensational. The 5-member defense team remained intact, though, and reporters speculated that a plea deal was in the works, but the attorneys denied it. They expected to prove Cynthia George's innocence, they insisted, but trial watchers believed they had chosen a more challenging route to accomplish this goal. Nonetheless, there were advantages to a bench procedure. "They're arguing a fine piece of the law," said one analyst, "and the judge won't tend to hate George as much as a jury, because she'll work with the facts and not passion." In essence, the defense would be that there was no reason for Cynthia to want her former lover dead, so there was no motive for her to be involved in a conspiracy to kill him. Michael Bowler made the defense's opening statements before Summit County Common Pleas Judge Patricia Cosgrove. He claimed that Cynthia had ended her relationship with Zack and no longer had a problem with him. The plan was working, and she could feel good about it. Her infidelity had been due to her husband's busy schedule, which made her feel lonely. Assistant District Attorney Michael Carroll used the same strategy in the Zaffino trial. She had a problem and needed to be rid of it. She found someone to help her do it. The breakup with Zack had been difficult, and he would not let go. She and Zaffino had attempted Zack's life in May, which had been interrupted, and then completed it in June. Phone records confirmed it, as did withdrawal from the bank of the same amount of money Zaffino had used to purchase the motorcycle. Bowler put the whole incident in the context of Cynthia's life. She was raised in a lower-middle-class home but could not afford higher education. She met Ed George much older than she was and married him in 1984. But he was a workaholic, so she took up an affair with Zack for a decade. After they ended, he had found a new mistress. She in turn got involved with Zaffino, and they called each other a lot. That did not prove she was aware of or part of a plot to commit murder. Carroll believed that arguments over a child lay at the heart of Cynthia's motive for wanting Zack dead. Marianne Brewer, a former nanny in the George home, was aware of Zack's persistence and testified that Cynthia had felt trapped. They had often argued, especially over her daughter, whom Zack had fathered and whom he had threatened to take with him to Israel. George claimed she had been forced to continue seeing Zack to keep their daughter with her. There had also been a threat that Zack might expose their affair and publicly shame her. DNA had confirmed that Zack had indeed fathered the child, so he'd had leverage. The prosecutor also entered 2 letters from Cynthia into evidence sent to Zaffino in prison. She cried when she heard them read. The letters confirmed that she and Zaffino were lovers and were still quite attached to him. She had sent him a Bible and listed some of the saints in the Catholic religion. She spoke about true Christianity and discussed how often she prayed for him. Usually I blow your candle out at 11:30, take my cross to my bed and say my prayers. She seemed undisturbed in the letters that he'd just been convicted of killing her former lover. She also wrote one incredibly incriminating thing. She told Zaffino to follow the attorney's instructions because we cannot make one mistake. The following day, a damning bit of testimony was presented, the transcript of a phone call from Zaffino to his sister, demanding money from the George family to pay for a top-rate attorney like Johnny Cochran. "You tell them they will pay for it," he said. "Just get the checkbook out and don't worry about it, or they will lose their freedom." That was the deal. If anything happened, they would take care of it. I went through with my deal. Now it's their turn. They have no choice. George's defense attorney insisted that Zaffino referred to an agreement in 2002 that the two would share legal expenses. In the call, Zaffino never directly implicated Cynthia in the murder. A counselor whom Cynthia was seeing before Zack died testified that she had said that her lover had grown difficult and she was trying to find a way to get out of the relationship. He had become obsessive and threatening, calling her every 2 hours, which scared her. She could not afford to tell her husband about Zack or her new lover. She had confided that a divorce would impoverish her. The counselor suggested she hire a bodyguard, but she had discontinued her sessions with him before providing specifics. He did not know the name of her lover. Ed George also testified. Despite her infidelity and the public embarrassment she had caused him, he defended Cynthia against the conspiracy charges best he could. He described the harassing phone calls and constant hang-ups at his house and said he had not known until after the murder that Zack had fathered one of Cynthia's children or that she had had 2 extramarital lovers at once. He said he had taken a marriage vow, for better or worse, and stood by her and would remain married. To the surprise of many who attended the trial, Cynthia did not take the stand in her defense. Zaffino, too, refused to testify, although he had told his sister that he'd been offered a deal if he would implicate Cynthia George. At the end of 7 days, the case went to the judge. By Monday, Cosgrove had found Cynthia guilty of complicity in aggravated murder. She received a sentence of 23 years to life, the same as Zaffino's. She was found innocent of the May 8th conspiracy to commit aggravated murder. Before she was led to jail, she insisted, "I didn't do it." Then she smiled broadly for her mugshot at the reformatory for women in Marysville. Many reporters commented on that. The untold story revealed. After the verdict, the Beacon Journal carried a story about the downfall of Cynthia George. Born beautiful, she capitalized on it to advance herself and her ambitions. She grew up in a small bungalow, a coal miner's daughter, and dreaded poverty. Yet neither that dread nor her Catholic piety had prevented her from acting in a way that threatened her marriage. Her desire for attention from men outweighed her other concerns. Active in high school, she could not afford college, where she had hoped to study art. She worked mediocre jobs, but her fortune changed when she met Ed George in 1978. She was on the dance floor at his restaurant and bar. He had never been married, and she caught his eye. In 1984, they wed in style before 500 guests, although she came to view him as more a father figure than husband. He continued to work long hours and was rarely home. Still, she lived in a $1 million mansion, a far cry from her childhood home. Together, they had 5 children and adopted 2 more, but even that wasn't enough to keep Cynthia from roaming. The nanny indicated that she had been more concerned with herself than her children. She spent a lot of money on clothing and was obsessed with her appearance. In December 2005, Cynthia finally broke her silence to tell her story. The Cleveland Plain dealer printed it in detail. Now 52, she explained that Zack had intimidated and frightened her. She had gone to Zack's home in 1998 to tell Bonnie about the affair, but instead of finding her, Cynthia ran into Jeff. She said he punched her in the stomach, throwing her to the garage floor. Then he grabbed her by the hair and dragged her up the steps. He pushed her into a closet and got an AK-47. Placing the end of the barrel in her mouth, he allegedly said, "You're not playing the game." She talked about how Zack initially made her feel special, while her husband made her feel the brunt of dad jokes. Zack had thought she deserved better. He lied about being an oncologist, which was soon revealed, but Cynthia laughed it off. In fact, as an operator of vending machines, he had plenty of time for her, so she did not mind. But she claimed, when she wanted to break it off, he forced her with threats and intimidation to continue the relationship. He told her that her life was not her own to decide. He even threatened to hurt her children if she did not cooperate. He had instructions ready for her, including a demanding call schedule. If she did not comply, he said, he would terrorize her family and torture her to death. She grew depressed, and a friend urged her to enter a beauty pageant. She did so and came in third runner-up. She soon met Zaffino, who made her feel better. She claimed she purchased the motorcycle for him so he'd have a vehicle to rescue her. Cynthia claimed she wanted to testify during her trial, but two of her attorneys insisted she not take the stand. While her story sounded good in places, it was never subjected to cross-examination. George's conviction overturned Cynthia, then retained new attorneys, Bradley Barbin and Max Kravitz, who filed an appeal, claiming that Judge Cosgrove should not have allowed Michael Bowler and Robert Meeker to represent Cynthia because they had brokered the suspicious deal that provided $1,500 from the George to Zaffino and his attorney. Due to this conflict of interest, the new legal team argued that Cynthia George had been denied effective counsel and thus should receive a new trial. Before the trial, Bowler and Meeker argued that their involvement was legitimate because the payments were in the interest of sharing information. Cosgrove had decided that the agreement would not be prejudicial to the defendant. Now that was under scrutiny. However, the issue became moot on March 27, 2007, when the 9th Ohio District Court of Appeals voted 2-1 to reverse Cosgrove's conviction of George. The justices ruled that the evidence was insufficient to prove guilt and ordered her to be released. Prosecutors appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court, but on August 30, 2007, the higher court upheld the reversal. Cynthia George was declared not guilty and would therefore, by her constitutional protection from double jeopardy, be immune